Hello. So glad that you're here today with me, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. Um, Before we go any further, I want to do a social emotional check in and just ask you, how did you sleep last night? Sleep has been elusive for some people in this pandemic. It's definitely something that's disrupted and it's kind of out of whack. Um, and since the focus of part of my talk today is going to be about vulnerability, I thought I'd share with you my last worst night's sleep. It was actually a couple weeks ago, and I was thinking about this weekend's conference, this Aspiring Educators of Wisconsin Social Justice Conference. And I knew it was coming up, and I thought I really need to get my thoughts together and think about what I want to say. So just before bed, I looked up the program, and wow, I was so impressed by the people that you're going to hear from. And I felt inadequate and a little bit overwhelmed by the people who I was going to be sharing your time with, because you're going to learn so many amazing things. And overwhelm is somewhere I think we need to start today. So, how many times in let's just say the last week, have you thought or said any of these things? I'm so sad. Or it feels like things are never going to change. Or I don't know what to do. Or I can't even listen to the news anymore. This is so tragic. All of these are feelings that are very valid and very real, and something that we as Americans can really take ownership of. But I think that's where I can come in, because my goal today is that instead of asking, what can I do? Or thinking, my voice isn't the one that's needed here. I hope that by the end of our talk today, that you can see that it's possible to do this, to think about how can we see the overwhelm and feel it, but still take action, and be aware that taking action is not just for ourselves or for someone else, but it's for the future. It's about thinking about generations beyond us, and that is where change can be affected for the most people. So the focus of my talk today is cultural humility. We're going to talk about embracing vulnerability so that we can elevate student voice for social justice. And my name is Erin McCarthy. I want to tell you a little bit about the ideas that I want to get across today. And this is the focus of where we're going. So a few things, right? To begin with, two kind of ideas here. I want to talk about how you can own your story and use it to reflect on who you are. It's a starting point. The reason why we do that is so that you can be open to your students' stories. You want to be able to be in a position where you can guide them to reflect and help them to find their strengths, no matter what age they are, so that you can empower them to build on those strengths and to find new strengths. Third, we want to talk about setting an intention of cultural humility. The goal behind this is that we make equity a part of our practice, because it's something that takes practice. It's not something you do once and you got it. Our goal here is that for your students, you want to train them because they're the next generation, and hopefully they will step into the role of equity warriors if we do so. And then finally, we want to talk about recognizing your own vulnerability. And the reason we do this is because it gives you an incredible power to connect. I mean, think about the responsibility in our hands is that we work with and we are bringing up the most vulnerable people in the world, children. And we want to teach them how vulnerability can mean curiosity, right? We want to teach them how to be comfortable with curiosity by going on a journey of learning with them together. All right. So I think a good place to start is about owning your story and thinking about what parts of your story do you want to share. So I'm going to start with a little bit of my story. And the first part is the context. You can see me circled in this picture. I'm pretty sure I was in about 4th grade in this picture. And this was my entire school. So this is kindergarten through 8th grade. And the school got much smaller over time in 5th grade. And then 6th, and then 7th, and then 8th. Each of those years, I was the only person in my class. So as you can see, there wasn't a lot of what we call diversity at my school. In addition, I didn't have people to really collaborate with or compete with. And so I didn't know what I was missing out on in that sense. But I was able to have curiosity drive everything that I did and learned. And when the teacher was done teaching me and had to go on to the next grade level, she sometimes said, read the encyclopedia. And I did. So that tells you a little bit about where I come from. Step one in owning your story is decide what parts of your context you want to share and allow students to share with as much or as little with you as they want to when they're comfortable. So part of my context is that I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. And when I was a child, Harold Washington was the mayor of Chicago. He was a Black man. And before him was Jane Byrne, a woman. And so as far as I knew, politics-wise, Black men and women could run the third largest city in America, and that was just the way the world was. Not anything unique about that. These are some of my heroes. Wonder Woman was my hero. She was on TV. I had her doll. Princess Leia was in the movies. I even had female G.I. Joes because I have two brothers. And so I learned as a girl that women are powerful and women are strong and women are part of the story. Or the second thing about owning your story is to ask yourself, why am I sharing this story? Like, why do I want to do this? What do I have to bring to the table? So a little bit about why I talk about cultural humility has to do with my job direction, I guess, that I took. I've had so many jobs in my life. This is a few of them. I think there's a few more that I've left off the list. Certainly, I've had more than one job at a time. Some of them are paid. A lot of them are unpaid. But that's an important message that I like to get across, is that all labor is valuable labor, even if we don't value it monetarily. But cultural humility-wise, being in so many different positions allowed me to be a person who is always learning and always learning about the culture and the people of every workplace and trying to get the lay of the land before I jump right in. And so a part of that story is also thinking about what about those specific experiences made me who I am. So I've done a lot of work with kids this year about telling their stories because of a project we're working on. And think about how your experiences made you who you are. So two of my key experiences would be that I was a museum education manager before I went into the classroom. And I worked at the Wheaton History Center in the suburbs of Chicago. And we did a program every February and March. It was called No Rights, The Injustices of Slavery. And I learned the importance of language in telling a story, because that really says it all. Like, that was the focus of the program. This was unfair. This was unjust. There were absolutely no rights for enslaved people. And I learned about person first language, We talked about people who were enslaved or enslaved people, not slaves. I also learned about bringing history to life. That's what I loved about museum education. So the picture on the right is actually a drawing of Ellen Craft, who escaped from slavery by disguising herself as a man because she had very fair skin. And her husband was traveling with her as her enslaved property. And so that was a remarkable story to dress kids up and get them into that position. Secondly, then I got my dream job as the education manager at the Swedish American Museum in Chicago. So that required cultural humility. I am not Swedish. I don't speak Swedish, but I needed to. And I needed to sing in Swedish and do Swedish folk dances. But my favorite part of that job was our Children's Museum of Immigration. And all of the children who came for school tours and giving them the opportunity to own that story and to be the experts on immigration and to be able to teach their classmates. I loved empowering them to do that. So fourth element of owning your story is to think about, how does this story reflect my values? And how is it going to guide me about where to go next? Those are the best stories. They lead us somewhere. They make us wonder what's next. So I am the 2020 Wisconsin Teacher of the Year. And it's not because of me being the best teacher. It's definitely not why I'm here talking to you. It's because some of the ideas that I've had and I can write about and speak about resonate with people. It also, though, means that I take on this role and I look at it as though I am a student of all the teachers and all of the students of Wisconsin. I also am a student. I'm a student of culturally responsive practices, abolitionist teaching, and strengths-based school culture. Those are the things I passionately am curious about. And definitely, this is the one idea I talk about as much as possible. I've believed for a long time and made it my work to make sure every child sees themselves as a part of America's story. So that's how we own our story. And that's how we share the parts that we want to share. But of course, none of us are a single story. I hope you've had a chance to use this TED Talk. It is very powerful. But it reminds us that we aren't a single story. Our students aren't a single story. And certainly America is not a single story either. So the question becomes, what do we do about that? You know, in 2020, June of 2020, we passed a milestone in America, and the children born were a majority multicultural children of color. The way the Census Bureau says that is that more non-white children were born than white children, which of course centers the story on whiteness. But that's the whole point, is that that's shifting and that's changing. And our reality, which we cannot do anything about, nor should we want to, is that we have more children in our schools than we have for a long time who are not white, Anglo-Saxon, but they are American. And so that's our challenge, right? How do we honor all of their stories? How do we respect and honor their cultures? How do we bring them through? Use a social justice lens to help empower them. So what I like to do whenever I'm thinking about a unit or a lesson or even just one day's activity is I like to start with reflection and then define some terms and then take some action steps. I teach 8th grade social studies, and 8th graders love to think about taking action, but they do need a lot of guidance. So I have a lot of practice with that. I actually thought that I was pretty good at culturally responsive teaching until about 3 years ago. Let me tell you a little bit about a student. I'm going to call her Silvera. She came to our school in 8th grade. It was her first experience in public school. Before that, she was at a Waldorf school for her whole education. She was very quiet. She was artistic. She had a group of friends that formed, and she was Puerto Rican. And I think part of her context, what's really important to know is that her class was known as the mean class. They just were accepted by parents and teachers and their fellow students as just being mean, just who they were. They're just not nice to each other, which I had a problem with. And I refused to kind of just accept that. I thought that was really just unfair to all of the kids in that class. However, that was the context, and it did change the way I did things. I was responsive to what they needed, and I moved up some of the lessons about empathy that we used to do kind of in the middle of the year. And I chose this activity because I found it at Facing History and Ourselves, which has great resources, and it was about getting kids to see what they had in common. So the first thing you did was you would find someone who had the same color hair as you. And you'd find that person, and then you'd have a conversation, right? Talking about discrimination. Have you ever seen it? What have you seen? All right, we'd go on for a little bit, and then you'd go find someone with the same height, someone who's the same height as you. A little conversation. Then you have to find a third person. This person has the same color eyes as you. They have a conversation. And then you look for someone who has the same hand size as you. And it was very intentional, the way you went from physical outside things and you kept getting closer and closer. You looked into someone's eyes, you stood back to back, you put your hands up against each other. And it made you realize all the things that you had in common, even if your experiences were different when you had the conversation. And I really thought it went pretty well until a few weeks later, Silvera's mom came in for a parent-teacher conference. And she said that she really felt like I was making Silvera feel different. Silvera had come home and told her that we did an activity in class where you were supposed to find someone who had the same skin color as you. And of course, because she was the only Latinx student in my class, there was no one who had the same skin color. And I was kind of dumbfounded because I know her class was the first class I did this lesson, and I know I didn't say that. And I know that wasn't the intention. But she also said that Silvera thought I was singling her out and making her uncomfortable because I used the word we so often. And my rationale and my thinking was that I was talking about we, as in all of us, we're a community and we're going to include everybody. But she thought we meant we, the white people, or we, the people who live in Greendale, which is the suburb where I teach. And because she didn't live in Greendale. And so that was the reality that she saw, even though it wasn't the reality that I thought I had created. And she moved on, and she left our school, not because of social studies, but a lot of things were challenging about being in a public school after being in a Waldorf school, and challenging about that class. But overall, it was just really disappointing to me, disappointed in myself. I felt humbled, and I felt really vulnerable. Because I thought I was doing things right. And it turns out I wasn't, because if that one kid felt uncomfortable, something was wrong. So I haven't forgotten her, and she serves as a reminder about cultural humility, that it's a practice and it's something we're always working on and learning more about. So let's talk about cultural humility is. Think about, I created this infographic about creating a curriculum with cultural humility so that we can have equity, we can include and think about diversity and what every single child needs. So to begin with, cultural humility was defined. It's been used in the business world for a lot, but Gordon Nakayama Hall defined it in Psychology Today magazine, and he said it's about being respectful, considerate, interested in learning more, and being open-minded. I think it's easiest to understand it when we think about what it isn't, which is when we make assumptions, we act superior, we think we understand more than we actually do, and we come into every situation with that attitude or tone. So when you think about culture, it's very multidimensional, right? We think about culture. In my class, we talk about it as being like who you are and what is important to you. But it's made up of many different parts, right? So some of the elements, just a few of the elements, are ability, or sometimes we think of disability, different abilities, race and ethnicity, gender, religion, your citizenship, nationality or documentation status, social class, sexual identity, age, so many elements to culture. So next thing I want to do is not just have my voice be the only voice here, but I want to watch this video that I found for Indigenous Peoples Day and used in class. And I think it's going to give us the chance to think about what does it mean to the people who are speaking in the video to open up space for identity. So that is the intention behind watching the video.
Before I begin this morning, I'd like to recognize the Algonquin Nation, on whose traditional territory we are gathering. We acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land.
Wherever I go on God's green earth, I do the Lakota tradition of acknowledging four directions, the land, and the people living there. Munchimaka, as I call Grandmother Earth, the land, I view her as a sacred, living entity, and that's the way we acknowledge it in Lakota thought and philosophy.
As a Native person, I'm ready for any kind of confrontation that might come up, or I'm preparing myself to remind people of all those things that they forget about. I was at a meeting in Minneapolis, and the room was primarily non-Native people. I was in a non-Native organization, but this executive director got up and said, "Okay, we're going to get started." So everybody, was sitting down and getting quiet. And she said, "I'd like to get started by acknowledging the indigenous culture of Minnesota." And I was like, whoa. And it just made everything fall away a little bit from me. My guard went down. I was more relaxed because by saying that, that means she understands something that is just you can't talk about, right? It just relaxed me as a minority, as a woman, and as a Native person. It just pulled away this layer that's always there. It was super cool.
We're at a time where non-native cultures are understanding the traditions of indigenous peoples for probably the first time in our histories. So like when I go to New Zealand, the protocol is to acknowledge each other's ancestors and your mountains and your rivers. And that's such a beautiful tradition. When people are in that space and say, we acknowledge who you are, this land, where your people come from, they're saying we acknowledge a relationship, but we're also creating that relationship. This is a good thing.
The important thing would be that folks would then sit with that. Like, what does it mean that our settlement is occupying this space? And what responsibility do I have considering that legacy to these contemporary things, right? And how do I stop distancing myself from that? Ideally, that would be, for me, the impact that this has. If you start acknowledging that the land that you're standing on and the space that you are in belong to people that are still here, like, make so much more room for understanding of all these other issues. It's one of those little things that, like, if it could just tip a little bit, all the like dominoes that could fall from it, I think are important. Now I'm like imagining it and like wanting to live in that, like the thing that I'm imagining, like, yeah, that's actually really beautiful.
It's just being a genuine human being, to acknowledge each other's histories, the good and the bad.
So I just think such a beautiful idea of opening up space, how it creates space for people to be who they are and to acknowledge challenges. And like, that's ideally what we want a classroom to be, is just a space for everyone to feel themselves, be themselves, and present. So how do you start doing something like that? I think of it as a census where we're looking at our population. Who is the population of my classroom? And what's the population of my curriculum? So who are the people who are on my walls? Who are in the examples that I talk about? Who are the authors, the heroes? Who are people making a difference? So I can honestly say none of these people are actually on my walls. It's very hard to find educational posters about Asian Pacific Islander history. I definitely do an investigation of Mary Tape, who fought for Chinese American students to go to school. Patsy Mink is a remarkable woman to talk about. And I need to do more with the history of Mr. Thind, who fought for citizenship after fighting for his country and took his case to the Supreme Court. So then we want to talk about balance. We want to make sure that just having a group there represented in that census of your curriculum is not enough. We want to think about who are the victims, the bystanders, and the upstanders in examples, in our overall story, in little stories that we share. Are we focused just on obstacles? Are groups always overcoming obstacles and we don't want to cause trauma by what we're doing? We also don't want to invoke just sympathy, but also empathy, so you can connect and imagine the experience of others. It's actually pretty easy to find activities and lessons these days on Japanese internment or incarceration, as it is now called, during World War II. But there's also the story of Fred Korematsu and the Korematsu Institute, which talks about how he stood up for this, against this violation of his civil rights, and took his case to the Supreme Court. I find that amplifier.org is a great place to go for free art by artists. You can also support them financially, which represents very diverse and people who show the complexity of American culture. I have another video for us to watch, less than 4 minutes, and I want you to just see, like, how can you, once you're aware of this sort of thing, how does it influence the way you look at things? So I want to see if you recognize the bias in this video, and we can talk about that after it's done.
So you're reading an article online when you get an instant message with a link to a funny photo, which of course you have to share. And now you're reading your Facebook news wall, which sends you to a video of a panda bear attacking a kid. And now you're reading Wikipedia to learn everything you can about the violent behavior of panda bears. And this is what 3 minutes on the internet can be like. We live like this all the time, and it has to have some kind of effect on us.
The net is making us more superficial as thinkers.
That is Nicholas Carr. He is the author of The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. To understand this whole thing better, we need to go way back in time to say, like, the prehistoric age.
You wanted to know everything going on around you, because the more you knew about your surroundings, the less likely you were to get attacked by a predator. And there's even evidence that our brains release some dopamine, pleasure-producing neurotransmitter chemical, to reward us for seeking out and finding new information.
So getting distracted felt good and helped us stay alive. But the problem is that nowadays, predators aren't much of an issue, but we still have the same brains. And also, there's the internet, which is...
It's an incredibly information-rich environment that the net creates for us, and that's why we use it so much. I mean, sounds, pictures, words, text. And what this tends to do is promote a sort of compulsive behavior in which we're constantly checking our smartphone, constantly glancing at our email inbox. We're kind of living in this perpetual state of distraction and interruption.
Which is dangerous because...
that mode of thinking crowds out the more contemplative, calmer modes of thinking.
And that focused, calm thinking is actually how we learn. It's a process called memory consolidation.
And that means the transfer of information from our short-term working memory to our long-term memory. And it's through moving information from your working memory to your long-term memory that you create connections between that information and everything else you know.
So you've got this awesome life-changing piece of information in your short-term memory, but then you hear that email ding and poof, there it goes. That email takes its place and you never get a chance to learn anything, all because of one distraction.
So attention is the key, and if we lose control of our attention or are constantly dividing our attention, then we don't really enjoy that consolidation process.
But I can hear it now. Someone out there is saying, what does learning matter if all the information in the world is just a Google search away? Well...
that is kind of shortchanging our intellects. If that's the way you're using your mind, just kind of searching very quickly and finding information and then forgetting it very quickly, you're never building knowledge. You're kind of thinking like a computer.
Which means that our very humanity is at stake. And it would be a shame if we all got assimilated because, well, humanity is pretty neat.
I really believe that if you look at the great monuments of culture, they come from people who are able to pay attention, who control their mind. That's what allows us to think in the highest terms, and think conceptually, think critically, think in some very creative ways.
And it's this kind of thinking that's at risk, being eroded one cute cat video at a time. Don't get us wrong, the internet is good for lots of things, and it should be celebrated. But the best thing we can do for our minds is to find some time every day to unplug, calm down, and focus on one thing at a time.
All right. Did you notice the bias in that video? I'm going to be honest, I showed it a couple times in class before it hit me that all of the examples of the pinnacles of culture and thought were men. No Katherine Johnson as a scientist or mathematician. No Mary Shelley as a great writer. No Ida B. Wells as a civil rights leader. Nope, not a single woman was represented. And that's a bias that we don't even think about, and it wouldn't have been hard for the creators of this video to include at least one woman to make things more balanced. And that's the sort of thing you start to recognize when you look around. I think it's important that we reflect and we spend time to ask ourselves, do I personally feel that I'm missing out if I don't have diversity in my life? Like, do I look around at my friends, at my neighborhood, at the colleagues that I work with? Then do we have to hear perspectives different than our own to understand what we actually think better? Think about the echo chamber that we live in. And seeking out other points of view, that is a challenge. It definitely is, but it's something you can take on because we know it's the right thing to do in a pluralistic society. And then finally, we're going to create a checklist that we think about every single day. And I have a checklist right by my desk. It's actually about the 5 rights that I think all children deserve. And I go past it every day, and it's just a reminder, this is what you're supposed to be doing. This is what you're really here for. So thinking about learning goals, our planning our unit, writing our question on the board. When we're reviewing, we're asking, does what I included show that we value difference in our classroom, in our school? And am I including stories And am I vulnerable enough to admit I don't know all those stories, but I'm curious enough to find out? All right, so vulnerability is kind of where we want to go next. And thinking about that, I made this checklist, but then I rethought it. So we're going to come back to the checklist. But first, I want to pause. It's been a lot of information so far, and just let you know, like, this is work. Like, I am asking you to dismantle your framework in your brain and rebuild it. It's hard work. And I do consider it work that I have to do constantly. And I think it's your work too. It's the work of all educators. It's actually the work of all Americans because it's the world that we live in. Let's also define professional. You are either training to be a professional teacher or you are a professional. That means that you have engaged in certain learning to prepare you for this profession. This is a field that requires knowledge. You have knowledge of how children develop. You have knowledge about how their brains work. You have knowledge about the best ways to select activities for them and help them grow and take care of them. You are a professional. However, you are also vulnerable. Vulnerability means that we have openness. It means allowing our weakness to be known. Now, certainly if we're talking about classroom management, vulnerability doesn't seem like something you want to show your students. However, vulnerability is something we all have to admit. We cannot do everything. We cannot know everything. And admitting that opens us up to possibility. So I would love to tell you that in my 9 years of teaching, I have moved mountains and dismantled structural racism. And I have been very supported where I have worked. That's why I've stayed where I am. And I'm trusted as a historian, as a national board certified teacher, as an educator, that the decisions I'm making are what's best for kids. But I have to tell you that this year it has felt more like I'm chipping away at that mountain with a little spoon. It's been an overwhelming year. It's a vulnerable year. And the mountain is there, and recognizing the mountain is really the first step. One thing that I've learned from this year is that transparency is so important. Of course, we would all welcome parents at any time in our classroom, but virtual learning really opened up what we do to a whole audience, right? We were sometimes sitting in the middle of someone's living room, and it's easy when you hear a small snippet of what someone says, when we live in a soundbite society, to think that you've caught everything and that you need to raise some concerns about it, which we want people involved. We absolutely do. But I need you to remember that you want to be clear about your language at all times so that you are sending a clear, intentional, controlled message. Education, every single word you say is absorbed by the children in front of you, and you need to stay in control of that message, and we need to be transparent about what our intentions are. I do have an agenda as the teacher of the year. I believe, and as an educator, that all of these things are why we teach, that we want kids to find their own voice, to be inspired. We want them to be motivated to overcome obstacles. And we want them to be the kind of people who seek out diverse viewpoints and who work for equity. That is definitely something that I'm working for every day. And when you're a person who has sort of a spotlight on you, it's important to know what you want people to think about what you're saying and to be in control of that. But of course, it really absolutely is not about me. That's really the most important thing to think about. Even though you have children riveted and paying attention to you every day, it's about them. They are your focus, and it's about every single child. You want to hear what parents have to say, and it is about their child for them, but for you, it's about every single child in your classroom. I have a foundational belief, which I come back to constantly in my classroom, and that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which begins by saying that every single person deserves dignity in their life every single day. And that means that the transgender student in my class deserves dignity every day. And my Black and Brown students deserve dignity, and my Asian Pacific Islander students, and my students who may have a disability, and my students who may have special education needs, and my students who are Muslim students, and my students who are Jewish students. All of these students, every student deserves dignity every single day, and I have to think about each and every one of them when I'm making my decisions. It's hard to think that the work we do in social justice would be something that people are opposed to. Yuri Kochiyama said, "Our ultimate objective in learning about anything is to try to create and develop a more just society." And that is what we are working to do. However, it's really important that we're aware that there are people, there are forces out there organizing who do not believe social justice is the work of education, who do not think that it has any position in a classroom and are working against it. So it's important that we, as professional educators, are very clear about our message, that we're upfront, right? So if the question is going to be, why did you choose that source? You know why you chose that source. With Universal Design for Learning, we have many, many different kinds of sources that we use. Why? Because we have standards, we have curriculum. We have the needs of all those different students at all different reading levels, all different language levels, all different interest levels. We have to keep them engaged in what we're doing. And then we have to deliver all of that. As an educator, you make 1,500 decisions a day. And the more work we can do up front to be clear, the more we are able to serve our students and give them our attention. It's hard to think about these experiences as being things that parents would want banned, but your goal is to be on the right side of history. These are all examples of things this year that parents didn't want their students to participate in. And I think it's important to recognize this is sort of the situation that our country is in right now. But I didn't say no to Dr. King and poetry, or to investigating bias and discrimination, or to thinking about how art can expand our mind to amend history instead of erasing it. This is what came of that second lesson about discrimination. And I really love the fact that my students can speak for themselves. And if you look at the take action box, it says stereotypes keep us from connecting because they cover and blind us from who a person truly is. And that's it. That's why we do what we do. That's why education is more than a test. So it's important that as an educator, you think every day about modeling calmness, being transparent about what we're doing based on standards and curriculum. But also, we do the critical thinking. We are thinking critically about the decisions we make, and that's why we make the decisions that we do, because they're best for kids and for equity. Our goal really is to open up the world for our students. That's all that we can ask to do. Give them the tools they need to understand what they are seeing and what's in the world around them, because someday they may want to take action when they are ready to take action. My goal is to give them what they need so they can learn, and also to prepare them for the future. I don't know what kind of jobs the future will have, but I do know that we're working on making it more equitable with more different kinds of people around all the time in all kinds of positions. Our goal overall is to create the next generation, right? We want to empower them. We want them to be the kind of people who look around the boardroom, the lab, the legislature, or a future classroom and say, there's some voices missing here, and we can't make decisions until we hear from everyone. We want them to be people who look out for others and want to hear as many voices as possible. So we need to figure out how to empower them. First of all, how we do that is we don't let children get caught in the overwhelm. We are teaching with equity, and what every child needs to be successful is to not be overwhelmed by something they don't think they can do or that's too much. We don't want to inflict trauma on anyone, right? We also need to think about equity means giving you what you need. So some of you need the seed of an idea that someday later may grow into something else. Some students are ready to blossom right away and take action to be activists and influencers. One of the things that I found really helpful and that I actually use with my students is Deepa Iyer's social change ecosystem. And it's that idea that we don't need we don't everyone to be a leader. Not everyone can be a leader. We need to think about all of these different parts throughout history have worked together to actually make change happen. And I asked students, we walked through this, I asked them to mark, who do you think you are now? What's a role you play? What was a role you'd like to play in the future? Then we reflected on what Grace Boggs said about, you cannot change society until you see yourself as taking responsibility for changing it. She also reminded us that it's the small activities that we do that affect the invisible fabric of our connectedness, that we are all connected and we can make a difference in little things that we do. I'm going to come back to this Eleanor Roosevelt quote, but it's one of my favorite to think about with kids, about little small actions are where human rights begin. And so by reflecting on this, my students recognize themselves as being, for the most part, many of them felt they were caregivers, which says so much about children today. They see themselves as healers a little bit, visionaries, experimenters, all kinds of different things, all sorts of different ideas. So let's come back to Eleanor Roosevelt. She is definitely one of my heroes because I think she took her position as an elite white woman of privilege and she used it to influence change where she was when she could. She was very fearful, but she found bravery. And so she says, where after all do human rights begin? In those small places close to home, so close and so small, they cannot be seen on any maps of the world, but they are the world of the individual person, your neighborhood, your school, your college, where you work. Those are the places where every single person seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. And unless rights have meaning there, they don't have meaning anywhere. And I think that's so important for us to remember. Also, we need to think about how much can we do? How much can we influence? I am a white woman of color, or I am a white woman in a state where there are few teachers of color. 6% of our teachers in Wisconsin are people of color, and that's been shrinking. Yet 31% of our students in the public school system are children of color. And we definitely need to do everything we can to make a difference, to change that, and to make it more equitable. But what role can we play? I think this is important to recognize this isn't someone else's work. We have to recognize our vulnerability and we have to do the work. I think about this past summer, I had the opportunity to be interviewed by our local news about how I teach Black history as part of American history. And I did say to the reporter, are you sure I'm the person you want to talk to? Like, should I really be the face of this? I'd written an article about it and I went ahead with the interview and I ran into some neighbors when I was walking in my neighborhood and they said, oh, we saw you on the news and you did a great job and we're so proud of what you do. And then their voices dropped and they said, do you even have many Black students? And that reminded me that if I'm going to stand up and say that this is stories that I think that are important for everyone to know, that I needed to help them understand these stories were important, my elderly neighbors, this is America's history. This is who we are. This is our work, everyone's work to include all of the voices that have been marginalized throughout history. You can do it. I've done it. I've started to do it. I continue to do it because our kids deserve it. They deserve better. They deserve to recognize that there's things they don't know because there's things you don't know and that we can all work on being better at this. All right, let's talk about setting some intentions to make a difference. The Chopra Center tells us that an intention is a directed impulse of consciousness. It contains the seed of your aim, right? And like a real seed, you can't grow if you hold on to it. You have to release that intention. But imagine thinking about some intentions. So I took this list, this checklist, and I turned it into some intentions that we could set. I admit I am invulnerable. I am vulnerable, so that means my eyes are open and I can see things and pay attention to them. Having cultural humility means I'm here to listen first and learn. I need to hold space in every space that I'm in for others to speak first. I need to pause. Often cultures are more about listening than they are about talking. We are not that way in America, and we need to practice that more often. I think the idea of admitting you don't know something is a beautiful place to start, to imagine with your students to say, let's find that out together. Let's be open to possibility. Admitting I don't know, that's where you begin, is by admitting, I don't know. I don't know the answer. Let's find out the answer. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Could you say it for me? I don't quite understand, or I don't know what that holiday is. Would you mind telling me about it? I value difference. Imagine that as your mantra. We all have biases, even though we try to see our children through an open mind, our students. We need to remind ourselves to look for their strengths and assets and know that maybe they know their assets better than we do. I certainly hope they do. I hope their parents can tell us about their strengths and assets. I hope their community is a strength and asset. Equity is about being open to new ways to help each child. And again, parents are going to have ideas for how to help their child, and we have to be open to that. We would hope for an open dialogue. We need to be eager to listen and learn, not go into every situation as the expert, but to have humility and listen first. I think this is the most 2021 of these intentions. It's time to reflect, because some things that we've done in the past year have not been good, and we need to fail forward, right? Let's be uncomfortable and let's talk about what didn't work and what hasn't worked in a long time. This is so important. As a white woman, I try really hard to hold space and pause before I jump into a conversation. It's conflicting. I totally understand, especially if you're in meetings and spaces with men who don't practice this. As a woman, you want to make sure your voice is heard, but it's part of vulnerability and thinking about other voices that need to be heard as well. This is a concept I learned a little bit more about this year because I'm a student of abolitionist teaching. I discovered the work of Goldie Mohammed, who talks about joy is essential to curriculum. It needs to be part of our planning. And oh my gosh, once you say it out loud, you think, why didn't I think of that before? But the way that she writes about Black joy is something I don't know enough about, and I need to understand it as an outsider. I believe in this mantra as well. We need to be curious about what we are missing out on. What do I not know? So please, this is my ask. Be willing to share your story. Think of your story as a little light that can illuminate for others, especially if you please leave in your mistakes and your misunderstandings so you can learn from them and others can as well. Think about dropping a pebble into the water and the ripples reach a distant shore. Remember to share your story so that you can include how you relearned something and how you grew from that relearning. Because your story is a part of each of your students' stories. And we want that story to be about justice for all. And until we're vulnerable enough to realize we don't know all the stories, we can't be open to hearing them. And we can't empower kids to tell those stories. So as much as possible, I do like to share resources, and this would be a good slide to take a picture of because these are some of the things, some of the places that I've used to cultivate my learning. And I thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today.